Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen and heard nationwide. Today we shall discuss a book on the distortion of the American presidency. It is called The Cult of the Presidency and is by the senior editor of the Cato Institute, Healy. The book is more than timely and is chock full of relevant history, from the founders to 2008. Healy is with me today to discuss his book, and I am Lawrence Velvel, the Dean of MSL. Gene, thank you. I know you're in the midst of a book tour. You're getting no sleep. You're exhausted, but you're here to talk about this book, and we appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Gene, perhaps we could start by having you answer a more or less two-part question. One is, what is your opinion of the three candidates' views on the role of the American presidency in foreign affairs and in domestic affairs? And what was the framers' intent? What was their purport with regard to the president's role in these two fields of foreign affairs and war and domestic affairs?
Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot I could say about that. What I would say to start with, I think that this is going to be a very bitterly contested presidential election, and the idea behind what a lot of the candidates are saying is that they have very different views of the office, and that that there are severe differences between the candidates. But I think actually they have more in common than it may appear on the surface. One of the things they have in common, all of the three remaining major party candidates, all share a view of the presidency that I think is far less humble, far less modest, and far more powerful than what our framers had in mind. I mean, if you listen to the way some of the candidates talk, Hillary Clinton a few months ago in Pennsylvania said, the president must be ready on day one to be commander-in-chief of the U.S. economy, which is an odd notion.
That's called the command economy.
Yeah. As a colleague of mine put it, we eagerly await your orders, ma'am. And the notion of the audacity of hope is really the promise of redemption through presidential politics, the idea that the president can heal all your wounds. But John McCain, in the same sort of vein, McCain thinks that he's praised Teddy Roosevelt as one of our best presidents, and he said Roosevelt was great because he liberally interpreted the powers of the office and nourished the soul of a great nation, as if soul nourishing is part of the job. So I think there's a lot. The candidates have a lot in common in how they view the office, and I think their views of the office, this combination of, where they talk about the president in reverential terms, and they seem to be describing, a chief pontiff and a supreme warlord of the earth. This is not the framers' conception. The framers had a much narrower, much more modest conception of the office. Washington for instance, didn't go around calling himself everybody's commander-in-chief. Most often he referred to the office he held as the chief magistracy. And I can get more into the allocation of powers and the very limited role that the framers had for the presidency in foreign affairs and domestic affairs. But I think the main thing that I find interesting about the current race is sort of the narcissism of small differences, that these candidates really have a lot in common on the role of the presidency, and they embrace a role that the framers would not have recognized.
Gene, why don't you get into some of the specifics? Because as was said at lunch by somebody, and as I'm sure you've thought and I've thought, we have people in national office today, including on the Supreme Court, who are going to judge some of these things. We have people who profess to be followers of the original intent, originalists. And what one finds is that their views of executive power are anything but the views of the originalists. So why don't you get into some of the specifics, if you would?
Sure. Well, let's take the war power, the power to launch a war. The Bush administration's position on this, and unfortunately it's not too different than the positions of a number of prior administrations, is that they can launch a war with Iran, a war with Syria, what have you, without so much as a permission slip from Congress. This is not the framers' view, not in the slightest. Madison said, in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which which grants the war power to the legislature. George Washington, the original George W., he didn't think that he was invested by the mere fact of being commander-in-chief, was invested with the power to decide on whether and when we go to war. He even doubted his ability to launch preemptive strikes on hostile Indian tribes. There's a letter from him to the governor of Georgia saying, I can't go beyond the line of defense without authorization from Congress. So this was, and you hear this phrase, the commander-in-chief, all the time, the president's commander-in-chief, which modern so-called originalists seem to think gives him the ability to go to war at the time of his choosing. Well, even Hamilton in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 69, says that he explains what this power means, and he says it means nothing more than the president is the first general and admiral of the Union.
Right.
And generals and admirals are very important. They have an important role, but they don't get to decide, whether and with whom we go to war with.
I noticed that just today, there's a story in the paper about Bush ordering Rumsfeld to secretly plan the war against Iraq. And they bypassed a lot of the top people in the Pentagon because of that. And everybody knows, because it's been in the papers time and again, that we had soldiers in Afghanistan, special forces of one type and another, and in Iraq before those wars were even authorized by Congress. These days, Congress doesn't really make the decision for war, does it? It sort of gives that power to the president and says, well, you decide if we should go to war, and if you say so, we'll do it.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his book, The Imperial Presidency, says that, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's something to the effect that the story of the growth of the presidency is as much a story of congressional abdication as it is of power-hungry executives. And so you do see, particularly in the area of war, there's a repeated phenomenon where Congress punts to the president because they don't want the responsibility that the Constitution gives them. As I point out in the book, I'm certainly not the first person to make this point, but the authorization that we got for the Iraq War in October 2002 is structured almost the exact same way as the authorization for the Vietnam War in the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, in that it doesn't have the directness of, say, a formal declaration of war that says, okay, we're going to war. What both the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the October 2002 resolution do is they say, the president has all the power to use all necessary and appropriate force should he decide that he wants to. And in each case, it was several months after the passage of the resolution before the war ramped up. Right. Now, one of the reasons Congress does that is because Congress, it's very advantageous for any individual congressman or senator to be able to give the decision to the president and hedge their bets. If the war goes well, they take credit. If the war goes badly, they blame him. They're not implicated in the decision. So you actually have people who can say they were sort of for it before they were against it, and they can't, and you saw Hillary Clinton has said that she wasn't voting, even though she voted for that resolution, to give the power to the president to go to war. She says she voted so he could be a better negotiator or something.
Right, and Kerry said the same thing.
Right.
And I think that, as you said at lunch, and all of us knew at the time, this was a authorization, more than an authorization. This was a decision, go fight. But we're putting it, last analysis, we're putting it in your hands. By the way, Gene, you're quite right. The same thing happened in Tonkin, and it took months before and afterwards. The Congress got angry and said, we were never authorizing war. their intent may not have been to authorize a wide-scale war, but when you read the words,
Absolutely.
yeah, when you read the words, that was a lot different. Basically, the presidency, as you describe it, and as I think all historians would agree with you by almost by and large, maybe except for certain things Jackson did for the Louisiana Purchase with Jefferson, but by and large, up until Lincoln and the Civil War, the presidency was not the policy-making branch of this government. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's as you point out, there are debates about this, about when the so-called modern presidency really came about. I mean, there's certainly hints of what the office was going to become in the 19th century. In Jackson's claim to be a tribune of the people, in Lincoln's vigorous exercise of war powers during the Civil War. But initially, the office, as the office was designed to be, it had a more modest role, particularly in legislation. There are several occasions, it sounds weird to read these things today, but where Washington writes a private letter saying, he felt a little sheepish about making policy recommendations to Congress, and he didn't want to make it sound like a tone of command. The State of the Union address, the first two presidents delivered it in person before Congress. Jefferson said that this is like a speech from the throne, and he thought this was not consistent with small r Republican principles, and so he had it messengered over. And that tradition held for 112 years, I believe, until Woodrow Wilson, who had a very different idea of what the presidency should be, changed it and began delivering it in public. And then you see it goes over the radio. It becomes, in the Truman administration, it goes out on TV for the first time. LBJ moves it to prime time, and so now you have the speech as we know it today, which everybody gets up and claps, every 10 seconds in the speech, and it's a laundry list of policy commands. Well, this is very inconsistent with the president's initial role. The president was not supposed to be a populist leader who would issue policy commands to the legislative body. The president's role was really, for the founders, much more of a defensive role, not only in foreign affairs, where he had the power to repel sudden attacks, but also in domestic affairs. He was Congress was supposed to be the real locus of action. Right. The president was sort of a goalkeeper. The veto was there so that he could check Congress when it tried to do anything too rash or when it transgressed its constitutional bounds. But he was never supposed to be the figure that everyone looks to solve whatever the problem of the week is.
That would have smacked too much of kingly prerogative, I think, in the framers' minds. And that pretty much lasted, after Lincoln, who did what he did because we were in a war, it went back to being the government was dominated by the legislature. In fact, Woodrow Wilson wrote a book called Congressional Government. It began changing with the progressives around the turn of the century, and Theodore Roosevelt, Herbert Crowley, the editor of the New Republic, and a major progressive, and Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson. Why don't you discuss the roles of the progressives in general, T.R. Wilson, Herbert Crowley? Why did it all change at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's there's why it all changed at that time is you could write volumes on and not get the and not get to the bottom of it. But I do think the progressives were a key role. I mean, a lot of people seem to think when they think about how the presidency grew that it was inevitable, that broad changes in broadcast technology and in material conditions and so on made it inevitable that the office would take on broader powers. So it's almost like a Marxian sort of, changing material conditions lead to a different political institution. And I think there's something to that, but I think when you look at the progressives, you start to recognize how important ideology was. They were very self-consciously opposed to the framers' model of checks and balances, and in particular to what the framers hostility towards executive power, um, and in contrast with the role that the framers saw, a much more unromantic and businesslike role for the president, where the president is mainly supposed to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. The progressives wanted, well, Herbert Crowley described Teddy Roosevelt once as a sledgehammer in the cause of national righteousness. And so this was their vision of the presidency. It was a powerful force for accumulating power and promoting reform. And so they were able to take advantage of a couple of big crises, a couple of world wars and a Great Depression. And by the time you come out of World War II and into the semi-permanent emergency of the Cold War, you have an office that's vastly different from what I think even Hamilton envisioned.
Right. Gene, weren't the progressives driven in part by the inability to have reform obtained through Congress? The progressives started, or at least their forerunners, the Grangers, started in the days when the average working guy, really, they had put him to the wall pretty much, and conditions were really terrible. It's been discussed here in the context of other books on this program. And you couldn't work through Congress because, just like today, I'll reiterate that, just like today, Congress was bought and sold by big money. And so they looked at the presidency as the only way to get things done, and there was an idea of expertise sweeping the world in those days, all over, in South America and in Europe. And all of this also played a role with the progressives too, didn't it?
Sure. I mean, and the progressives, none of this is to say, I mean, the progressives were aiming at some real problems. I don't mean to suggest that this was a sinister ideological takeover from the get-go. They had, in good faith, thought that strong executives were necessary to handle some of our social problems. But their conception, and they, as I said, they're hostile to checks and balances, hostile to the framers' view of executive power, the distrust of executive power, and the framers sort of baked gridlock into the system. They wanted it to be hard to get things done. The progressives wanted it to be easy to get things done, and so depending on your view of anyone's individual view of some of the progressive reforms, you get the good with the bad, maybe. The centralization of power. The problem with centralizing power is the same power that can be used as a force for good can also be used as a force for evil.
And has been extensively as part of the problem, as a lot of us see it. You describe Woodrow Wilson because, let me preface it this way. Woodrow Wilson, FDR, Truman, maybe not Eisenhower. That's an unusual thing, but maybe not Eisenhower, and maybe not Carter, but every other president contributed, every other president since Eisenhower, contributed to the growth of the power of the American presidency. Now, as I say, it started in the 20th century after Roosevelt, and Taft was a different animal. Then you got Wilson, whom you describe, well, there's another way to say it, as a bad human being. What was this guy all about? The polls all rank him, in the top 10 or so, and you don't think very much of him.
No, he was, I think he was a terrible president and a bad human being. He had the worst crackdown on civil liberties in American history. He got us into a war that was, pretty pointless carnage. He was a racist and an all-around bad guy, bad president. But you're right that in most of the historians' polls, he does very well. Is top 10, and I think that reflects this unconscious bias that a lot of historians and presidential scholars have, which is a bias towards action. So Wilson dreamed big. He tried big things, and he had soaring rhetoric and grand ambitions. And that, unfortunately, will get you further with historians than just being a president who presides over peace and prosperity, who allows who allows the economy to flourish and people to get ahead in their lives without screwing it all up. Yeah. So I think in some ways, some of the people that are at the bottom of conventional presidential rankings should be at the top, and vice versa.
Right, I understand. And I don't know if we'll have time to get into it. That's really cute, though, in a way, because the way you feel about some of these things like, the end of the 19th century presidents, Harding, Coolidge, in the 20th century. Pretty much, though, since FDR, Kennedy, Johnson, Truman, Nixon, Reagan, the first Bush, the second Bush, Clinton, these have all been activist presidents in one way or another. And they do that certainly in foreign affairs, which you've described. Although one thing that you might add is it's also true, isn't it, that in the 1980s and 1990s, Reagan, George Bush, and Clinton all went to war without congressional authorization, or in Clinton's case, even though Congress had said no.
Right. Yeah. The imperial presidency has become a semi-regular feature of American life, and you do, most of the post-war presidents fit into that mold.
Yeah, and you also mentioned, and I found this striking, because 10 years ago we all went and saw Wag the Dog and laughed, and this couldn't happen. Actually, there's some social science research that shows that it does happen, isn't there?
Yeah, there's some uncomfortable evidence from economists and political scientists who have looked at the decisions to use force and found that it happens more frequently among first-term presidents and presidents that are in a rocky economy. That happens, I believe it's twice as frequently as it does for lame duck second-term presidents and presidents who are enjoying a good economy. Now, none of that's to say that they deliberately and quite consciously and cynically decide to, I'm going to distract the public by blowing stuff up. I think it's more the case that if you're president, you're constantly presented with a host of plausible options that you could target, and perhaps you're more likely to subconsciously when you're facing political difficulty. All of which is to say, I think it should be harder to use force, and that the framers were quite wise in trying to separate the command from the decision to use force.
Just to cut through some stuff here because of our limited time, this idea of giving the president the right, if he wishes to go to war, you go to war. Authorization. This is big time on the domestic scene. I mean, much of congressional legislation is phrased that way. I remember back in '71 or '2 when I moved back to Washington from Kansas, we brought some cases about the wage price freeze. What had happened was that Congress had said, because the Democrats didn't want the responsibility for this, they had said to Nixon, you want to freeze wages and prices, you have the authority. Now, if you want to, go ahead. He did. They blamed him. He blamed them. And the point was, it was typical of these delegations, which the Supreme Court permits wholesale, so that Congress doesn't even have to make decisions anymore. They say, all right, you do it if you want to do it.
Yeah, you're right. There's an exact parallel, too, to what goes on in foreign affairs. The original idea is that a delegated power can't be delegated, so Congress has to make the law. I mean, that's Congress's job. But, particularly after the New Deal and, the process of modern government has been passing vague statutes that endorse high-minded goals. Protection of endangered species, for example, is a good example, and delegates to the bureaucracy, the executive branch bureaucracy, the ability to actually fill in the gaps. So this also is a sweet deal for Congress because they get to endorse the high-minded principle, save endangered species. Then when the Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, decides to protect the spotted owl and it angers loggers throughout the Pacific Northwest, they get to, as somebody said, kiss both sides of the apple, because then they get to rail against the bureaucracy that's enforcing the law that they passed. It's very similar to what happens abroad. They get to punt the decision to go to war to the president and criticize him when it goes wrong. And what Congress ought to be doing in both cases is what the Constitution requires it to do, which is actually have an up or down vote on these important decisions.
Yes, the bureaucracy, you spoke of it as filling in the gap. The whole thing's a gap.
Yeah.
They do 90% of the some huge percentage of the legislating. This has all happened because James Madison turned out to be wrong in what he thought with regard to why each branch would protect its own interests. Explain why it turned out to be wrong for the Congress.
I think, yeah, and I like James Madison quite a bit, and I think the framers were very far-sighted in most areas. But so Madison's notion was that in some ways that the system would be self-regulating because, very wise in a sense, because he didn't want a system where, and the framers didn't want a system that depended on you just continually electing good people to office, because as we all know, you can't depend on that. So his conception was that the branches would check each other because it would be in the individual interests of the people in the branches. He says the interests of the man must be connected to the constitutional rights of the place. They thought they had done that, and he says that ambition will counteract ambition. So you have the president fighting to protect his powers, Congress fighting to protect its prerogatives. Well, where it hasn't worked out, as you point out, is at least in the last 60, 70 years, is with regard to Congress, because the interests, it's worked out pretty well with regard to the president. The individual who's holding the office has every incentive to conserve his power, to protect himself from overreaching by other branches, and he's done.
We hear a lot about that from Cheney today.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, he has a conception of prerogatives that might have surprised George III. But it's true that presidents do a good job of husbanding the power of the office, keeping it from being overridden. Congress, the problem is that the individual incentives of congressmen are not well aligned with the constitutional rights of the place. There's no mileage really for congressmen to demand that they everybody stand up and be counted on issues like war, because they can enjoy their enormously high re-election rates simply by issuing press releases, passing out pork, earmarking, and a vote on a controversial subject like war is maybe not the smartest thing to do going into an election. And so you don't, ironically enough, I talk about this a little bit in the book. So George W. Bush has, over the years, he's claimed that Congress has no say in intelligence oversight, that he doesn't have to obey the law that Congress passed, setting up a framework for surveillance, that Congress has no say in the decision on war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Insult after insult to Congress's constitutional prerogatives. The one time that I can think of that Congress unified and really got angry about an executive branch assault on their prerogatives was when Representative William Jefferson had his office searched because the FBI had found $100,000 in his freezer. So this was an outrage. Congressman Sensenbrenner had some luridly titled hearings about the executive branch out of control, because they were, whether you agree with it or not, they're searching the office of a guy who seems to be a crook. But this was hitting Congress where it lived. But the other offenses to Congress's prerogatives didn't really matter much to your average legislator.
Yeah. It's gotten so bad. You point out something in the book, which I knew about, but not as well as I should have, not as well as I understood it after reading your book. Today, not only does Congress not write the laws, which are written by lobbyists and by the executive branch quite often, it doesn't even read the laws sometimes before it acts on them. And the Patriot Act, you point out, is a wonderful example. And sometimes the legislature's procedures are deliberately jury-rigged so they couldn't read the law if they wanted to read the law.
The civics book ideal is you think they write the laws, they read the laws, and if they think the laws are a good idea, they vote for them. But well, you've got a couple of problems there. You got some of these statutes that pass. It would be physically impossible for a legislator, even given ample time, to read these omnibus statutes and figure out what's in them.
Some of them are 1,000 pages.
Right. You'd be reading all day long, and it's, as you know, it's not the most enjoyable reading.
Yeah.
The other problem is, as you mentioned, sometimes the votes are strategically scheduled so that you couldn't read the law if you were going to. So you have enormously important decisions on surveillance, on budgets, on intelligence agencies, and nobody has read, except for some staffers, has actually read what they're voting on.
And the irony is then you go to court about some of these laws and the courts pretend to find the congressional intent.
Yeah, yeah, as if it can be discerned.
As if it could be they have enough trouble when there are speeches on the floor. These are situations we're speaking of now where Congress hasn't even read what it's passing. You talk about the nature and expectations that people have for the presidency today. Why don't you describe what you think about that?
Well, I think that people invest far too much. They look to the presidency for things that it was never intended to provide, and that no office really could. We look to the president in a way that British people do not look to. No one expected Tony Blair to save everyone's soul, to heal spiritual malaise within the country and bind us all together. And so I think that people expect too much of the presidency, and the candidates. I started out, I think, by talking a little bit about how the candidates talk about the office, but the candidates talk this way for a reason. So when Barack Obama goes to South Carolina, as he did months back, and gives a speech where he says, "I believe that with the right presidential leadership, we can create a kingdom here on earth." He's talking this way because people actually believe that the presidency, or at least in some sense believe that the president can heal all the nation's wounds, teach your children well, that the president is the person in the Hillary Clinton commercial who's going to answer the phone at 3 a.m. to keep your children safe from harm. Now, the distance we've traveled from the modest aspirations that the framers had for the office has pretty much guaranteed that there'd be an unhealthy concentration of power in the office. And the fact that people look to the presidency to fulfill all these needs means that the incentive of the person in the office is going to be to seek more power. I can give you one, I think, pretty good example of that, just briefly, is the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. As somebody put it, in the aftermath of Katrina, the same people, the same half of the country that had been complaining for years about George W. Bush being a dictator were suddenly screaming bloody murder because he was failing to do, in the aftermath of Katrina, a sufficiently convincing impersonation of a dictator. And none of this is to deny that the federal government deserves plenty of blame for the inept response to that catastrophe. But when you listen to the debates over it in the aftermath, it became clear that the blame was going far beyond what FEMA was actually legally responsible for, and people sort of expected the president to swoop in like a superhero and take care of this problem. Well, predictably, George W. Bush went to Congress and started lobbying for a law that would make it far easier for the president to take military command of a disaster area and declare martial law and use troops in policing situations, which the Posse Comitatus Act and the Insurrection Act restrain him from doing. And he got that. He got that power in the fall of 2006. And for a couple of years, the president could have been the potential commander of a federal war on hurricanes and had enormous power to use standing armies at home.
Yeah.
The provision was actually repealed quietly, thanks to Senator Patrick Leahy in January. But I think it's a good example of how the expectations that people have of what the office should be capable of lead directly to a concentration of power in the executive branch.
Yeah, and it's so dangerous. I've been in a town in the Vietnam days where there were tanks in the street, and when you realize what it means to have the Army involved, and he even got Blackwater involved down there in New Orleans, you realize this is bad stuff. This is bad stuff. Gene, you speak about what the current candidates have been saying. It's a remarkable difference, isn't it, from the days of from Washington right up until Lincoln, when for a candidate to go around talking, speechifying, campaigning, this was regarded as a mark of unfitness for the office.
Yeah, there was a notion that that active campaigning was sort of demagoguery. I mean, the tradition eroded a little bit in the 19th century. Some of the Democratic candidates got more into stump speeches, but very early on, yeah, it was viewed as completely out of bounds for the president to be a populist figure who was visibly seeking office. The old saw was the office of the presidency is neither to be sought nor declined. And even up into the early 20th century, you had some front porch campaigns. Right. Well, the late 19th century, McKinley ran a front porch campaign. And it's almost unimaginable today that a sitting president would not leave his front porch, or a candidate would not leave his front porch or leave his town much to campaign for the office. And I think as the role of the president has changed, you've seen a change in the powers of the presidency. Yep. And one of the problems with this role for the president, I mean, in a way, it reflects what the public wants, but it also, these promises stoke public expectations and lead to this sort of same cycle of concentration of power.
Now, when you talk about some of what you just talked about, the front porch campaign versus the stumping, you say, I have felt for years, literally years, could never find anybody that would agree with me until I read your book, that the kind of person who has what it takes to run for the presidency is simply not the kind of person who is fit to govern, which harkens back to the old days of Washington and Lincoln. Explain why you say that.
Well, I didn't read his memoirs, but I saw a quote from Alan Greenspan's recent memoirs, where Greenspan says that, and this is a guy who's known a number of presidents, has said that. I think the quote is, he says, I've been pushing a constitutional amendment for years, and that is, anyone who is willing to do what it takes to become president is thereby disqualified from the office.
I love it. I'll vote for that amendment.
Well, it's true. I have a chapter in the book called, I borrow the phrase from F.A. Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. The chapter is called Why the Worst Get on Top and Get Worse. And it's about, part of it is about how the process of seeking and achieving office has changed over the years. Some of the reforms that the progressives were for, and this is totally unintentional, I think, on their part. It wasn't, I'm not sure they saw how this would work out. But the shift from the old party convention-dominated so-called smoke-filled room system to a primary-dominated, voter-dominated process has made the campaigns longer and longer and longer, particularly after the post-68, post-72 rules changes in each party for how the delegates are allocated, has demanded a much longer campaign. Campaign finance regulation has had some impact on this as well, because the money that has to be raised now has to be raised in smaller increments. But the upshot of all this is a very long, very arduous campaign, and as I've said, I don't feel sorry for the candidates, because they seek it out and they get what they deserve. But I think we do have to think about what the selection effects of this are, and who is not running that might be fit for office, and who is really driven to, I mean, I think many of us can understand the appeal of being president. You know, if nothing else, you get your own plane, and that's cool. But I don't think that very many of us, particularly those of us that are sane, would want to live that way. 2 years, glad handing your way around the country and never letting your guard down for one single moment. That you know, as in that the San Francisco comments made by Senator Obama. You know, anytime you let your guard down a bit, the pressure of it has got to be enormous. And I don't think it selects for anyone who's willing to go through that process. Disproportionately, you're going to get people who really want power. And I think it's unlikely that they're going to try to relimit or exercise restraint once they've run that gauntlet and achieved the office.
Yeah, they want power rather than wisdom, right?
Uh-huh.
You know, you have to be egomaniacal to begin with. Nobody who's not egomaniacal would do this. Then you have to live out of a suitcase for 2 years and on airplanes. Then you have to spend extensive amounts of time. All politicians even complain about the amounts of time you have to spend begging for money. You have to issue platitudes wherever you go. You have to make promises and counter promises. As you say, you have to keep your guard up at all times. This is not sane. This is not sane, and this is not a way to learn what must be done to better the country, either at home or abroad, if you ask me.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't really select for the kind of people who are going to have wisdom in the and restraint in the exercise of power. And I think you know, the second half of that chapter is about the environment of modern White House life, which is totally surreal, and how that might impact people who are making very important decisions. And I don't think I really appreciated what made a good president until I got into the research for that chapter, and how difficult it is for the quote-unquote most powerful man in the world to get good information and to find out what's going wrong and to have people treat him like a normal human being. I mean, most of us in our daily lives are, you know, have plenty of occasion, you know, to interact with people who don't think we're all that special and don't care what we think. And the president never has that opportunity, and it's very difficult to get people to give frank advice to the most powerful man in the world. And the smart presidents are people who have, like Eisenhower, who have recognized this and deliberately tried to fight against that tendency. But there's no reason why somebody with that sort of wisdom and appreciation of that difficulty is going to emerge from the modern campaign.
Yeah, precisely. You pointed out at lunch that Eisenhower would go into meetings and not tip his hand so people wouldn't know what the boss thinks, and he would have smart guys argue it out in front of him. Kennedy, you point out, and of course this is a famous episode, at the Bay of Pigs, when the executive so-called ex-com was meeting, he wouldn't even go to the meetings because he wanted people to debate with each other rather than look for his lead to see what he thought. He thought that way he'd get the best policy out of it.
Yeah, this is a problem that, you know, I mean, CEOs have this problem too, but no CEO can, you know, launch a first strike on another country or send the Sixth Fleet through the Taiwan Straits. So the president has this problem more than any other CEO, and there is this phenomenon where, you know, people they're competing for access to this guy. It determines their status and power, and there's a tendency to look which way is he leaning, and you know, line up behind him to preserve your access. And that is Eisenhower recognized, and as Kennedy came to recognize, that's no way to make good decisions. The best way is to hear smart people fight it out.
You know, you have something in the book which just shocked me. Apparently, this fella Joshua Bolten, who's running the White House now, he ends every morning 7:30 breakfast meeting with a statement, "Mr. President, thank you for permitting me to serve today."
Yeah, that's in one of the recent biographies of Bush. The name of the biography, but it was a guy who was granted sort of unprecedented access to the White House, And yeah, it's Bolton ends every meeting with, or starts every meeting with, "Thank you for the privilege of serving today." And a normal person probably, after the first time would take him aside and say, "Hey, cut that out."
A
We
normal
don't need
person
that.
would, if I may put it bluntly, a normal person would puke.
Yeah. But I think after you're in the White House for a while, you might come to think that these things are your due.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the problems, you mentioned that a CEO can't send the Sixth Fleet, through the Straits of Formosa or Hormuz or wherever. The framers dreaded the concept of a standing army, which has lain at the heart of a lot of what you've talked today, domestic, sending the army to do this or that in New Orleans. A standing army is one of the reasons that a single guy can do so much harm, because we have the most powerful military forces the world has ever seen, and he can just snap his fingers and say, "Go here, do that."
Yeah, and I think the extent to which the amount we spend on the military, the extent to which we're extended in some 700 bases around the world.
Actually, there's about 1,000, I'm told, because they're secret bases too.
Probably, yeah. This is just the publicly available Pentagon figures, I think. But it's really there's a scholar, Edward Corwin, who wrote that the Constitution's allocation of foreign affairs powers are an invitation to struggle among the Congress and the President. Well, Congress has sort of set itself up to lose, because we have an enormous military and a military that's extended abroad, and the President can use his commander-in-chief powers to, even in let's take the case of the Gulf War, before any vote was taken by Congress, President Bush, George H.W. Bush, moved 250, 400,000 troops into theater, and it becomes very hard for Congress to say no at that point. And so I think the size of our military force and the permanence, as you point out, I think Hamilton was an exception, but most of the framers hugely distrusted standing armies, and the Constitution limits appropriations for the military to 2-year periods, and there was never a notion that you would have this extent of a military force available.
The idea that you point out appropriations are available, and in addition to appropriations being available, they take money from one pot and put it into another, and so on. The executive does. It has never worked. That they used to say in the days of Vietnam, well, the Congress, if it disagrees, can cut off appropriations, starting with the White Fleet going around the world, and Roosevelt saying, TR saying, well, I've got enough money to send them to Hawaii, and if Congress wants to come back, they'll appropriate more money. It has never, ever worked.
Yeah, you need, it's a very tough political decision for Congress, and the Congress has the power of the purse. Theoretically, this is an enormous power, and you'd like to say, well, just don't fund the war if you don't like it. It's an enormously hard task, and the lesson of history is that even to get the sort of minor uses of the power of the purse that came at the end of the Vietnam War, to restrict operations in Cambodia and other places, things have got to get really bad before Congress is willing to exercise that power.
That is an exception to my comment that it never worked.
But I think it goes to your point, though, because it was well into the Vietnam War, and
it was over for practical purposes.
Yeah, and so it's never been used. It's never been used to actually cut off a war that Congress hasn't authorized right in mid-stride.
That happened in 1973 after 8 years of war, and it was only to stop the bombing of Cambodia. The war was lost beyond retreat.
Yeah, and I think even in that legislation, the president got a certain period where he could continue bombing. He vetoed it
and said, look, if you let me bomb till August 15th, I think it was, then I'll sign your bill next time. So they did that. The presidential domination of the news cycle has more than a little to do with the extent of the president's authority and his whip hand over Congress, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think also there's a huge There's a tendency, I think, in a visual medium like television to want to have somebody who's at the center of the story because we like stories. And so you do see in the news coverage, even when there's something like where the president realistically doesn't have much of a role, like the Virginia Tech shootings, there's the president makes statements whenever anything big happens in the country, and the media seems to look to the president to, and this probably reinforces the public's, I think, outsized view of presidential capacity. If you're constantly being shown in various contexts that this is the person you look to, so I think certainly the president plays a much stronger role in legislation than he ever was intended to, and that may account for a lot of the dominance of the news cycle. And I think part of it, though, is just this tendency that he's more interesting than an individual congressman or a committee. He's one guy, and we, even those of us who don't tend to like many of our presidents, tend to become fascinated with whoever's in the office.
I think that's a real truth. Even if we don't like them, we're fascinated by them.
Yeah.
Now, people don't believe that I'm favorable to the military. They don't know, in general, that I went to a military academy when I was a kid for a period, and that I have personal reasons for being very fond of the Navy and certain other respects. I really am quite pro-military. Having said that, isn't it true that what we have seen in the last 50 years since Truman crossed the Rubicon by taking us into Korea without congressional authorization, due partly in large measure to Dean Acheson saying, well, this is not exactly the time for constitutional discussion. Since we crossed that Rubicon, we've become a tremendously militarized country. So much of our economy depends on it. So many of our people are employed in military industries. There's this terrific focus on what our military is doing. This is one of, and of course we have, as we've just discussed, a huge standing armed forces. I mean, this is one of the reasons, is it not? And Eisenhower warned about this. This is also one of the reasons why the president has so much power, because, I mean, we're even talking about him, as people are beginning to comment, as commander-in-chief of the country.
Yeah, I think there's, I mean, I'm sure you've heard the phrase from Randolph Bourne, war is the health of the state. Well, war is specifically the health of the presidency. And we have become a tremendously militarized society. There's a great book about this by Andrew Bacevich called The New American Militarism.
Oh, yes,
and
yes.
He's a Vietnam vet and a former lieutenant colonel in the Army himself. He's now a professor at Boston University, and it's just a great book on the dominance of militarism in American modern American culture and politics. And yeah, the framers were actually pretty hostile to militarism. They looked at I have some quotes in the book from Ben Franklin and others about professional standing armies that would get Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity to accuse you of treason and suggest you should be locked up if they were made by a political figure today.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that this is a concern, and this trend towards militarism is in part driven by the fact that war is the health of the presidency, and that even when you have social problems, the so-called commander-in-chief tries to reconstitute them in military terms, with war on drugs or war on poverty.
Yeah. You say in the book that we have to become, quote, a normal country again. What do you mean by that? How would we become a normal country again? Let me just say one thing before you answer that. I do not think that it is without significance that Europe, which has suffered the horrendous ravages and the approximately 80 million deaths of 2 world wars, is far less militaristically inclined than we, who have never suffered an internal war since the Civil War and who don't know what it means, and that Europe is far less prone to rush to arms than we are. I would define that in part as being a normal country, although God knows it's not normal to lose 80 million people in 2 wars. But what do you mean when you say we have to become a normal country again?
Well, it does relate to foreign policy. I think that's an excellent point about the effects of the 2 world wars, and you know, I've heard people suggest that, and I think there's definitely something to it, that our relatively much easier experience in those wars has led us to think that problems that we should resort to the sword more quickly.
Can I interject something?
Sure.
Don't forget your point. When you say we had a relatively easier time, that's a true but staggering comment, because our time was so bad, and yet it was relatively much easier.
Yeah, and the enormity of the destruction in Europe. I mean, it's probably even an understatement. Yeah. My point. What was my point?
Well, you were going to what a normal country
is.
Oh,
a normal country. Yeah. I think that one of the reasons we have the presidency we do is because we've, some could question whether we've ever been a normal country, but for good or bad. But we have this Wilsonian notion, particularly among the elites. This is more of an elite phenomenon than maybe a voter-driven phenomenon, but that America is anointed by God to pay any price and bear any burden to promote liberty and democracy around the world. It is in many ways a really noble idea, and I think we should do more to promote liberty and democracy around the world. I just think that, well, certainly the lesson of the last 7 years is that using the U.S. military toward that end is, I think, a bad idea and a wrong idea, and it has had drastic and terrible consequences.
We have about 30 seconds left, Gene. How is it, in your opinion, that the one man who's been president in the last 60 years, who was a high-ranking military man, Eisenhower, Carter had been, but not as high rank, is the only president who appears to have had a sane purchase on the world?
Well, that's a tough question. I would say that that Coolidge was sane, Harding was sane. Gerald Ford, I believe, once described himself as disgustingly sane, and he was president by accident, so maybe that tells you something. But yeah, I think Eisenhower did, his military experience probably caused him to de-romanticize the military a little bit, and you saw that in his farewell speech, warning about the military-industrial complex.
And he knew how to control these people.
Yeah.
And he knew that the leader gets bad information unless he makes every effort to get good information.
Right.
And he knew how to hide his hand.
Yeah.
Big time. Gene, thank you.
Thanks so much.
The book is something that ought to be it brings up subjects that ought to be the subject of our political debate, because the subjects it brings up are beyond important. They go to what's going to happen to all of us and to the country itself in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And to the audience, thank you. Be with us again next time.